An introvert from Norway looks at his own shoes. An extrovert looks at the other person's shoes. As a young boy, my dad was an Air Force officer, so the first 11 years of my life, we were transferred around places where he was assigned. One of his places was Norway. So I lived in Norway when I was from 3 to 6 years old. So my earliest memories are from Norway. We lived a little outside Oslo in a little town called Hun, and later moved to Bærum in an apartment building. One of my fond memories is my parents bought me a Norwegian sled. They call it a rattkjelke. You sit on it with runners on it and a steering wheel, and it has very fine blades, and it goes really fast and has a handbrake. I would zip down the streets on that. I took my dad on a ride on it one time in Bærum. He said it scared him to death. I also have some memories of cross-country skiing as a young boy out in the woods. It snows a lot in the winter. Part of Norway is as north as Alaska, so in the winter, most of the time from December to about February, you don't see the sun, but you see the northern lights almost every night if you're above the Arctic Circle. So I spent a lot of time looking up in the sky and enjoying those floating northern lights. In the summertime, the sun comes out, and if you're above the Arctic Circle, the sun's up 24 hours a day. It's basically Alaska. They enjoy the sun, and so did I. Even when you're down south, it's light. My mother told the story that when she was a young mother, she was ironing clothes as the kids went to bed and kept ironing and didn't realize until she looked at the clock that it was 3 o'clock in the morning because it was still light out. I was 6 years old. I only knew about 3 words of Norwegian. One of them was the word for ice cream, iskrem, because my parents would speak in Norwegian and say, well, shall we have dessert? And we'd all go iskrem. And they also taught us to say thanks for the food, takk for maten. The interesting thing, I think, was when I was a young man, after having lived in Norway for 3 years as a boy, I got the opportunity to serve on a mission for my church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Norwegians call it Jesu Kristi kirke, Siste Dages Hellige. My parents loved Norway. When I had the opportunity to go back to send in my application to be a missionary for my church, there was a spot on there where I could say back then, is there anything you want to say about your mission? I said, I'd like to go to Norway. And I did. And of the 4 brothers in my family, one of my younger brothers who was born in Norway and didn't remember it, he also went to Norway. He wanted to go. And years later, my parents went back as senior missionaries. I liked the fact that it seemed like what I was used to. People were similar in a lot of ways. I liked the mountains that I was surrounded by. I liked the fjord. And so really what struck me was really the scenery and the fact that they were easy to talk to as far as the language that I learned up to that point. I came to Norway with about a 6th grade grammar level. Found it very easy to pick up on the language and get to know them. And they were all interested in where I was from and what I did. And in that experience, I got to live in the Arctic Circle in the winter in a town called Narvik, and I lived on the west coast in Stavanger, and I lived in the capital city, Oslo, which we call Oslo. The experience there was interesting because their dialects are so differently spoken in different parts of Norway that you can hear the difference as you come to a new city. So I had to relearn my Norwegian each time I got transferred. When I got to serve in Norway as a 19-year-old, I went to the Missionary Training Center, which at the time was called the Language Training Mission in Provo. I found the Norwegian language came fairly quickly to me. I got to think that some of the words I was learning I had never learned as a 6-year-old. But it was a very easy language. I thought it was easier than Spanish even. I enjoyed learning the language. In fact, my first companion in the Arctic Circle in Narvik was a native Norwegian. And so we were together for 4.5 months without any other Americans around us. So I got the experience of being isolated, was surrounded just by Norwegians, and so I felt comfortable with the language after the 4.5 months I was with him. To the point when I came back to the United States to go to Brigham Young for my accounting degree, I decided I wanted to teach Norwegian during those 3 years. So for 3 years I was a teacher of Norwegian for all of the missionaries going to Norway that were American. It got the language in my head to where I still remember the grammar rules and most of the vocabulary. On Facebook, I had a lady reach out to me on Messenger and say, "Are you Dwayne Newfer, the son of Harold and Marion Newfer?" And I said, "Yes." She says, "I was your babysitter when you were 4 or 5 years old. I was a young teenage girl, and I just wanted to see if that was you. I saw your name. So now she's a friend of mine that almost always likes my posts. And so I chat with her in Norwegian on the Facebook. And she says, you helped me learn English when I was a teenager, because it wasn't something we studied as much in school. As far as food goes, I was very seldom invited to people's homes, so I mostly cook for myself. But I know they do like to drink a kind of a fruit drink that they mix with a concentrate and mix it with water. First time I had some of that, I thought the concentrate was the main drink, and thought, I wonder why they like this so much. Didn't realize it needed to be diluted. They do eat a lot of fish. I got to learn to love to eat salmon and shrimp. One time in Bergen had whale meat. They love their cheese. They love their fresh fruit, and pretty much like us, except for they're really big on fish. Well, the Norwegians complain about a little dish called lutefisk, which is speckled dyed cod, and I heard so many bad things about it, I never tried it. But they have t-shirts that say, oh, lutefisk. So it's something they're sort of required to eat at Christmas time. They're very honest people. They tell you what they think. They're very athletic. They love the outdoors. They're certainly good in the Winter Olympics too. They love to ski, which is one of my passions. They're very interested in the fact that I loved their country and I learned their language, and they appreciated that. Transportation is kind of like being in New York City, where you can get anywhere you want on public transportation, which was new for me. I was able to spend my whole 2 years in Norway without a car or without a bicycle, because I could get anywhere I wanted and I learned how to navigate. So in that way, it was nice to get around. I found that it was more expensive to live there as far as food. Rent was okay at the time. I also noticed that they were all very good, hardworking people. They felt like good, honest hard work was important. Norway was devastated during World War II by the German occupation, and I talked to a lot of Norwegians that were alive during that time, and prisoner of war in one case, and they talked about the devastation and how the houses were wiped out. And so a lot of the cities, especially in northern Norway and parts of western Norway, the homes were destroyed and they built them up again. And so a lot of what you saw was post-World War. There weren't a lot of ancient Europe type buildings that you're used to seeing. They're not as apt to look you in the eye and talk to you on the street and greet you and say hello. They're a little more, I'd call it taciturn, or maybe a little more not so outgoing as we're used to. I went to a Norwegian reunion one time where they talked about a Norwegian, or an introvert from Norway, looks at his own shoes. An extrovert looks at the other person's shoes. So that's not so much the case anymore, but they kid themselves that they don't usually talk to you on the street. But when you're in their home, they're all very polite, often offer you food to eat, and we often usually had to say, no, we're just here to present a message, or, we weren't there to eat. And so they were very hospitable once you got to know them, or once you were inside their home. So I was in a lot of homes where I felt very welcome. The Norwegians seem to be much more conscious of the world around them as far as knowing the news of the world. They looked very hard at the news to see if anything involved them when things were happening overseas. And they were also very smart and literate. In fact, the 4 Scandinavian countries, literacy is pretty much 100%. And I also noticed that in schools, they work very hard and they speak multiple languages. The middle-aged Norwegians, which would now be my age, I guess, they didn't grow up learning English as well, but at this point, anybody under 50 years old is going to speak very fluent English. In fact, almost everywhere, especially in the service industry. If you go to a restaurant or a store, they'll speak English very well. In fact, I had to work hard when I'd go back to stick with Norwegian, because they all wanted to speak English with me. I did find one interesting thing. About 3 years ago, I think it was, I took a tour on a boat. It was a ship line called Hurtigruten, which means fast route. And they flew us up to the Arctic Circle in a town called Kirkenes, which is on the border of Russia. And a lot of Russians came over years before, decades before, and set up shop and started working. And a lot of them didn't learn English in school, people that were younger than me or my age. And so when I spoke them in the shops, they spoke fluent Norwegian, but their English wasn't as good. So that's one of the few places in Norway where foreigners were living and were predominant. More so now, there's more people coming in from overseas into Norway. In fact, I'm on YouTube. There's a Norwegian teacher named Karensa, and she has a net school or an internet school where she teaches Norwegian with a bunch of teachers around the country. And they're geared for people who have moved in from other countries that need to have some proficiency in Norwegian, either go to university or to work. And she gears that to foreigners that are coming into Norway. That's something new since I was on a mission. It didn't used to be so many foreigners coming in. And so there's things Norway does to accommodate that. Well, I've been very keen on retaining the language, and I make a lot of effort to stay fresh with Norwegian. Once a month I meet with a group of older Norwegians that were boys in the war, and they tell me stories, and they meet at the Red Lobster over in Salt Lake once a month. Their agenda is to eat fish and speak Norwegian. And all they do is speak Norwegian and chat. In fact, they're called a fish club in Norwegian, Fiskeklubben. So once a month now, I chat for an hour in Norwegian. And it had been many years until I moved to Utah where I even got to speak it. Now I'm feeling comfortable again. So when I go back to the country, I love pulling people aside and talking to them and chatting in their language. And they're always very impressed that 40 years later, I'm still chatting in their language. So they enjoy that. I've found everywhere I've ever traveled around the world, if I keep my ears open, I run into Norwegians or Swedes. I studied a semester of Swedish at BYU after my mission, so I can speak a little Swedish too. And when I hear that Scandinavian, I'll start chatting with them, whether it's a Swede or a Norwegian. It's been Australia, the Queen Mary in Long Beach, Washington, D.C., Canada. Everywhere I've traveled, those Norwegians are just good world travelers. I remember in the Bahamas on a shuttle, there's a Norwegian next to me, and I start chatting, and he says, "You're American speaking my language?" And I said, "Yeah." So I asked him a bunch of questions there's some words I didn't learn on my mission because internet wasn't around. So how do you say internet? He says, "Internet." Okay. How do you say laptop? He says, "Laptop." How do you say mouse? He says, "Moose." Okay. So there is a Norwegian word. They're very much into the internet, and they've used our words. Back in the 70s, when I was on my mission, I worked in Stavanger on the West Coast, and there was a lot of offshore drilling going on. There still is. If I'd talk to somebody and I'd say, "Hey, where's your husband? Is he going to be home?" She'd say in Norwegian, "Nei, han arbeider offshore," which means he works offshore. So they incorporate a lot of English words. If you listen to them carefully, you'd pick up a lot of Americanisms that they've adopted. So that's an interesting part of their culture now. Når jeg var både I Norge som 19-åring, så bodde jeg I Narvik og Stavanger og Oslo. Jeg fikk lære mange dialekter, og jeg veldig glad I Norge og språket. Jeg beholder språket fremdeles, og jeg har fått besøke Norge et par ganger siden jeg bodde der. Så jeg veldig glad I Norge og det norske folk. Just said I love Norway.